Gear Seekers, I'm Nick. I've seen a lot of different benchmarking videos with the RTX 2080 versus the 1080 Ti and just a mix and match of really odd comparisons. So I wanted to do something slightly different and compare the same tier card from the same manufacturer over two architecture generations. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you hit that button right now and turn on that little bell to receive notifications. We upload basically every single day of the week, so do yourself a big old favor and make sure you're subscribed. In this video, we're gonna do something that we don't really do here on Gear Seekers and compare the Gigabyte RTX 2080 Windforce AGOC and the Gigabyte GTX 1080 Windforce AGOC and see what performance gains you're gonna get if you're thinking of literally upgrading from a Gigabyte 10 series card to a Gigabyte 20 series card of the same design. This video is brought to you by Cooler Master and the Master Case H500M, featuring interchangeable front panels, two giant 200mm addressable RGB fans for the ultimate airflow, and all of the front I/O you could possibly ever want. Find out more about the Master Case H500M at the link in the description. Let's talk about how we're actually testing this. We're using our GPU test system, which is running the Asus TUF Z370 Plus gaming motherboard with an i7-8700K with 16 gigs of G-Skill Triton Z clocked at 3200 MHz. Now, both of these cards have an almost identical cooler design, and you could probably mistake them if they're both sitting on the bench at first glance, which is why we're not going to talk about thermals, because the system we use to test these cards is also an open air system, so it makes no sense. This is purely about frames, because that's all you guys really care about, right? I mean, that's what the comment section usually says. Now, we ran 3 different benchmarks, all that use these GPUs in different ways, and they will show different types of gains depending on the situation and all of that other jazz. So without further ado, let's see what happened. First of all, let's start off with Rise of the Tomb Raider. We use this benchmark because it's pretty easy to switch between DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 and see what gains or losses could be had using a different graphics API. All tests were performed with the high preset with 3 different resolutions. We performed 6 tests in total. Now, the scores were the readouts from the built-in benchmarking tool. Just be aware though, these are benchmarks and they might not actually reflect how well a game will run at all. They're benchmarks, that's kind of the point of them. Right, let's get into what actually happened. For the 1080p test in DX11, we saw the RTX 2080 get an average score of 114 frames per second and the GTX 1080 get an average score of 88 frames per second. That's a performance difference of around about 29.5%. On to the 1080p in DX12. The RTX 2080 saw an average score of 105 frames per second and the GTX 1080 with an average score of 84 frames per second. Now, that's a performance difference of around about 25%. For the 1440p test in DX11, we saw the RTX 2080 get an average score of 72 FPS and the GTX 1080 get an average score of around 56 frames per second. That's a performance difference of around 28.5%. On to 1440p in DX12. The RTX 2080 saw an average score of 67 frames per second and the GTX 1080 saw an average score of 53 frames per second with a performance difference of around about 26%. For the 4K test in DX11 with the RTX 2080, we saw an average score of 36 frames per second with the GTX 1080 get an average score of 27 frames per second. That's a performance difference of around 33%. On to 4K in DX12. The RTX 2080 saw an average score of 33 frames per second and the GTX 1080 saw an average score of 24 frames per second. That's a performance difference of around about 37.5%. As you can see, the margins are getting slightly bigger as the resolutions go up. Let's move on to the Unigine superposition tests. For the superposition tests, we performed 3 tests in total. We used the 4K optimized preset, a 1080p Extreme preset and a custom 1440p test preset with depth of field and motion blur turned off. Let's see what happens. For the 1440p custom test, we saw the RTX 2080 achieve an average frame rate of 137 frames per second and the GTX 1080 with an average of 99 frames per second. That's a performance difference of around 38%. For the 4K optimized test, we saw the RTX 2080 achieve an average frame rate of 65 frames per second and the GTX 1080 perform an average frame rate of 52 frames per second. That's a performance difference of around about 25%. Lastly, for Superposition, we did the 1080 Extreme benchmark. This hurts basically every single GPU ever made, ever. It's not an easy one for GPUs to smash. For the 1080p Extreme test, we saw the RTX 2080 achieve an average frame rate of 50 frames per second and the GTX 1080 perform an average frame rate of 30 frames per second. That's a performance difference of around about 50%. Last batch of tests we did was with the Final Fantasy 15 benchmarking tool. Now this test is a little bit different to what you're used to. This test gives you a score based on the total amount of rendered frames. We performed 3 different tests all on the high preset at 3 different resolutions. And I'm guessing you know what the resolutions are already. For the 1080p test, we saw the RTX 2080 achieve a final score of 10,687 and the GTX 1080 perform a final score of 9,042. That's a performance difference of around about 18%. For the 1440p test, we saw the RTX 2080 achieve a final score of 7,817 and the GTX 1080 achieve a final score of 6,563. Now that's a performance difference of around about 19%. For the 4K test, we saw the RTX 2080 achieve a final score of 4,647 and the GTX 1080 achieve a final score of 3,708. That's a performance difference of around about 25%. What surprised me wasn't the fact that the RTX 2080 still performed very well. It was more that the 1080 actually held its ground. Sure, it's not the best performing Pascal card on the market, but for the MSRP at launch, that was like $549 dues versus the $799 MSRP of the RTX 2080, well, the 1080 still impresses me. You have to remember, the 1080 came to market almost 2.5 years ago, and the performance back then was mind-blowing. And if you compared that to the previous Maxwell generation, it was pretty impressive. The difference here isn't as notable at lower resolutions, but at 1440p and above, it's pretty noticeable. But does that make it worth the money alone? I mean, if you compare those launch prices to the mean performance across all of the tests we performed, you're getting around 28% of the performance increase for around about 45% more money. Whew. Ouch. That being said though, the 1080 doesn't support ray tracing, so I kind of understand where the price difference comes from. I think, I don't know. Since we don't have anything to test ray tracing with just yet, I can't say if it's worth the money or not. What I can say is though, from a performance standpoint, the RTX 2080 Windforce AGOC, it's a pretty impressive card overall. If you know anything about me as well, you know that I played Quake Champions on it as well. And at 4K Ultra, the RTX 2080 averaged around 105 frames per second on about 5 different maps. That's pretty freaking crazy for 4K Ultra in Quake. That's actually impressive. And they said that was an AMD optimized game. I mean, that number doesn't lie. For most people, I think the jury's probably still out on these RTX cards because there's just not enough to test yet. But for the enthusiasts like me, the time has come, guys. RTX is here and it's not going anywhere. If you're interested in getting anything mentioned in this video, we have links in the description. Anytime you use those links, you're helping us keep this awesome gear seeking dream alive. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. If you didn't like this video, You know what to do, and tell us what you didn't like about it, tell us what you hated about it, just pretty much tell us anything you think about this video. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. I'm Nick with Gear Seekers. You peek, we seek. And yeah, RTX, it's pretty good, but still, no ray tracing tests just yet. You're gonna have to sit tight and just wait, because we're gonna revisit this a little bit later.